Hi, today we're going to talk about the Contax 645 and what you can expect when you own this incredible camera. Hi, my name is Hunter Harrison and I'm a wedding and portrait photographer, and you can find me online at hunterphotographic.com as well as on Instagram and Facebook. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the Contax 645. We'll talk a little bit about the pros and cons of owning the 645. We'll also talk about the operation of the camera and then some errors that you may encounter when using the camera, which are important to know. The reason I'm making this video is I get a lot of questions from different people about the Contax in particular. They're interested in a hybrid or film-only approach to weddings, and they've heard of the Contax, but they don't know too much about it. It's a great camera to start off with, so it's definitely worth considering, but there's some interesting facets of the camera that are worth knowing before you purchase one. So that's really what we're going to talk about today. So let's first talk about some of the pros. I think the first most notable pro is the lens that comes with the camera. This is the 80mm Carl Zeiss f2 lens, and it is incredible. It has an equivalent 35mm focal length of 50mm, and it makes an amazing portrait lens. Because of the f2 aperture, you can of course shoot in dark situations, but on a medium format camera like this, you can back way away from your subject and they'll just take up a small portion of the frame and you'll still get an incredible out-of-focus background. Of course, as you work closer to your subject, the depth of field shrinks and can get down to just about a centimeter, which allows for these really ghostly images that are absolutely gorgeous. Another pro of the camera, which you can actually see here, is that I have the vertical battery grip attached. It's an accessory for the camera. It wasn't part of the original kit, so you can buy it separately, and I think it's really worth having. And most notably, the reason why is because it allows the camera then to take AA batteries. Normally the camera takes a CR2 battery that's kind of hard to find, so by having the vertical battery grip, you can move on to a standard battery, which is certainly really nice. And of course, it gives you a vertical grip when you're taking portraits. I think the other great reason to own this camera is, unlike some older medium format cameras, it does have autofocus. In fact, I have mine set up so it's set to manual most of the time, but it has a back button over here. So on demand, I can just push the back button and the camera will begin to autofocus for me. So that's certainly nice and an improvement over some older medium format cameras. Of course, cameras like the Hasselblad H1 also have autofocus, as does the Mamiya 645 AF. The other nice thing about it also has auto exposure. While I don't use the auto exposure that's part of the camera, it's nice to know that it's available. Instead, I use a separate handheld meter, which I think is really important. Lastly, I think kind of from a pro perspective is the simple operation of the camera. The setup is really simple. It's easy to work with on a regular basis. You have shutter speed up here on the top, exposure compensation, which only works if you're using aperture or shutter priority mode. And then of course the aperture here is controlled right on the lens. Other than that, it's a pretty simple camera to use, which is one reason I really like it. So also worth talking about are the cons, and the cons to owning this camera are pretty substantial. They're certainly worth considering rather seriously. I think the number one con is that it's pricey. The cost of this camera in the used market has been going up substantially. So just a few years ago when I bought mine, I picked it up for $2,300 and it was in pretty much mint condition. Nowadays I see pricing for the full kit, which would include the camera, viewfinder, film magazine and back, and the lens. The prices are somewhere between $3,000 and $3,400 depending on condition and other accessories that might come with it. And I don't see any sign of those prices coming down anytime soon. So it is quite an investment, especially for a camera that was made in the 90s. And that kind of brings us to another con, which is this camera's not made anymore. In fact, the company that made it, Contax, is now owned by Kyocera, and parts availability is becoming a real problem. The camera can also be finicky, so in its operation day to day you can have little problems here and there. Those problems are best solved by having quality parts, but as I mentioned, parts aren't really available anymore. And we'll talk about some of the finicky problems with the camera a little bit later. The other problem you can have with the camera, and again, this comes down to making sure you have high quality parts for it, is what's known as a film flatness issue. So in the back, we have the film magazine, which you can see here. And as the film winds its way through the camera, it passes over this film plane. Well, the film doesn't always lay perfectly flat, and that can cause focus issues, especially along the top of the frame here. If you're shooting at f2, this is a particular problem. As you get towards f4 and beyond, it's not a problem at all. But again, you're buying the camera because of the f2 lens. So if your film back and film magazine aren't in tip-top shape, you can certainly have some flatness issues, which causes focus problems inside of the frame itself. So definitely something to watch out for. I did have the flatness issue for a while with some experimentation using different magazines and different backs. I found the right combination where I don't have the problem anymore. So it's a workable issue, but certainly something you need to be aware of. I think the other thing you need to know from a con perspective is that the camera only works in full stop increments. So for example, here on the shutter dial, I can set it to 2/50th of a second, 500, 1,000, and so on and so forth. So I can't actually do third stops or half stops on the shutter speed. Now, film is pretty forgiving. It's not like digital. You can overexpose it and underexpose it just a little, and you'll certainly have no problems whatsoever. But definitely something to be aware of. When it comes to aperture, though, it does have indents for only full stops, but you can jam it between an indent and it will register a half a stop. So there's a little bit of a saving grace there. And I think the last con, definitely worth knowing, is the weight of the camera. Sitting here with it in my hands, it's very comfortable, but trust me, after an 8, 10, or 12-hour wedding day, the weight of the camera gets to be very substantial, especially when you have the battery grip attached. So you'll want to certainly have a good strap, good harness system, so that whenever possible you can take the weight of the camera out of your hands and gain a little bit of comfort. I've used a spider belt in the past with the camera, and that works great. I'm currently using a hold-fast harness, and that works well too. So those are pretty much the cons that are worth knowing about the camera. Moving on to the operation, there's a few things worth knowing. I do know that from time to time I get questions from other photographers who have a Contax and they've encountered a problem. So it's worth kind of walking through all the things you can do with the camera, because in knowing that, you also know some of the things to do if you are having problems. So as I mentioned, from a basic shooting perspective, shutter speed is up here on the top, working in full stop increments. Aperture is on the lens. And of course here is exposure compensation. Again, exposure compensation only works if you're in auto, aperture priority, or shutter priority. Now the sync speed on the camera, so for syncing with flashes, is 1/90th of a second, so pretty slow. And the reason is it uses a focal plane shutter in the back instead of a leaf shutter in the lens like a Hasselblad. But nonetheless, to put it into its sync speed, there's a little button here on the side. You push in that button, and then there's a little lever right here beside the shutter. And you can flip that between modes. You have bulb, and then X for flash sync. Then you have manual, aperture priority, and shutter priority. And you can see that little X right here. So that's how you would flip it into its flash sync mode. Now, of course, you don't have to use that mode. That will put it into 1/90th of a second. The other option is just to leave it on manual, and you can dial the shutter speed to 1/60th of a second or below, and of course at that point it'll sync just fine with flashes. Over here on the left side of the camera, there's a few dials worth noting. Here is the motor drive. So you have single, you can do continuous, and then you can do either 2 or 10-second timer release. So if you want to do a selfie, of course you can do that as well. I leave it in single because sometimes it will accidentally fire off a couple of frames if I only mean to do one, if it's in continuous. So I'll leave that in single. If you're having problems with the camera not firing when you think it should fire, chances are this has been accidentally rotated to the timer release. So go ahead and just check that and make sure it stays in single. We have the dark slide here. This dark slide can then be stored on the back of the film magazine. Or you can, of course, put it into the slot here, and that's useful if you want to dismount the film back. Here's where we set ISO. Real simple, just pushing a little button and then the dial rotates. In all honesty, because you're using film, the ISO setting for the camera really isn't that important. The ISO is really driven by the film. This dial here is only used for the sake of auto exposure. Again, I don't use the exposure meter inside of the camera. Instead, I use a handheld meter, so I really don't worry about this too much. Also here on the side, we have a little switch. Here you can push in a button and then switch this down. And what this is for multiple exposure. So for example, if you want to do a double exposure, you're going to use this switch. I'm going to walk you through here real quick how it works. First, we'll switch it down so multiple exposure is on, and then we'll take a picture. Now, if I want to do, say, just a double exposure, after I take that first photo, I'm going to go ahead and flip this off. And at this point, when I take a second exposure, then it'll go ahead and advance the film. So you always switch it off before you want to take your last exposure on that slice of film. Here we have a little trigger, and this is for dismounting the viewfinder, as you can see there. And also worth knowing, I think, is I get a lot of questions about how do I change the screen, the focus screen on the camera. A lot of people want to switch to a better matte screen, so they need to know how to switch this out, and it's super simple. Once you have the viewfinder off, you then grab a little handle right here, and you just simply pull up, and out comes the focus screen. To put it back in, you kind of slot it down here, and it can be a little tough to get in there, but once it's in, you push it against a spring and then drop it in place, and that's it. So if you do want to flip out your focus screen, it's really easy to do so. And we'll go ahead and put the viewfinder back on. Other than that, we have a little switch right here, and this is for opening up the film back, and then of course you can take out the magazine. On the viewfinder itself, I think there's 3 important things to know. Number 1, there's a switch up here at the top, and this is for either spot metering or scene metering. Again, I don't use the meter on the inside of the camera, so I don't care too much about how this is set. We also have a little switch here, and this is definitely something really worth knowing. There is a shade that can be dropped to cover the viewfinder, which is useful for very long exposures. You wouldn't want light coming in this way through the viewfinder, so you can hit this little switch right here. And then lastly, I'm blind as a bat. So having diopter adjustment on the camera is really important for me. This is the diopter adjuster right here, and even for me, it has enough range to it where I can see through the camera perfectly clearly. So that's really the operation of the camera. It's pretty simple to use, as I mentioned before, so not too many surprises. And now I think it's worth talking about some problems you could encounter. So as far as problems go that you can encounter while working in the field, there's a few key ones that are worth knowing. First thing, a lot of people complain about looking through the viewfinder and not being able to see anything. Presuming you've already removed the lens cap, the first thing you want to check, again, is this little shutter over here I mentioned before. The switchboard is very small, it's easily overlooked, so what you want to do is just go to that, number 1. Number 2, what you want to do is take off the lens and have a look through the mirror box and make sure that the mirror is down. Sometimes it can get stuck up. For example, if as you were taking a photo, the battery ran dry. So sometimes it can get jammed in the up position. If that should happen, the very first thing you want to do is go ahead and take the battery out and put in a fresh battery. The other thing that people can encounter is sometimes when they're taking a photo, there's sluggish behavior in the sense that the shutter fires just fine, but then the film advances very slowly or doesn't advance at all. Sometimes when you hold the camera up to your eye, you can't see the meter readings through the viewfinder. And if those kind of things happen, the number 1 thing you want to do is, again, go ahead and switch out that battery. The Contax can really chew through batteries. That's one reason why I use the battery grip, because it gives me access to AA batteries. if you don't have the battery grip and you're stuck using the CR2 batteries that go into the handle, what you want to make sure is that you have plenty of them on hand and use a high quality battery. You can get some really good ones off of Amazon at a discount, but they're very hard to find locally. Radio Shack might have them. So definitely keep a lot of them on hand because you will go through them quite quickly. And as I mentioned, if a battery is running dry, it can cause the camera to behave very strangely. So having the opportunity to go ahead and switch out for a fresh, high quality battery is certainly worthwhile. Now, another problem that people can encounter is if their battery did run dry or there was another problem, you may be halfway through a roll and you may not know whether that roll is in the right spot or not. So what it makes sense to do is to just go ahead and rewind that roll and get it out of the camera and get a fresh roll in there where you know it's sequencing through the camera just right. So how do you get the film out of the camera if it's only halfway through? There's a tiny little button right here. You just hit it with your fingernail, and after a second or two, the camera will go ahead and wind up all the leftover film. Lastly, a problem that people can encounter is when they look through the viewfinder, the camera won't take a photo, and what they're seeing in the viewfinder is a flashing E. Sometimes it's 1 E, sometimes it's 2, 3, or 4, and those indicate errors that have come up. You can look up the errors in the manual for the camera. If you don't have the manual, it can be downloaded online. But if you're working in the field, you probably don't have that with you. So what you want to do is go ahead and take apart the camera. You want to remove the viewfinder, you want to remove the lens and the film back. And what you'll see at each junction are little contacts right here. You can see them on the film or on the camera body itself. And of course, there's matching contacts on the viewfinder. Same thing goes for the lens and film back. And what you want to do is make sure that all of those are clean, they don't have oil or dirt on them. Go ahead and get them cleaned off, reassemble the camera, and chances are that will take care of the error code. And then you can just move on from there. So those are some of the problems you can encounter when working in the field. Otherwise, what I would say is, as I outlined, there's a pretty hefty list of cons, including price, parts availability, the weight. It can be, again, a little finicky. But I think what's most important to know is that the pros can really outweigh that. The quality you get out of this 80mm f2 lens is just absolutely stunning. It's the real reason to own the camera. If you think a Contax may not be right for you, or you're just beginning to kind of dip a toe into the film world, then I would highly recommend a Mamiya 645 AFD. Sometimes there's also an AFD 2 or 3. Those cameras operate much more like a modern digital camera in the sense that they work in third f-stops, and they have a dial at the thumb and forefinger on the grip, much like a digital camera, and you can operate the camera that way. They're also much cheaper. Typically you can find a Mamiya 645 AF for around about $1,500, and that would include the magazine, film back, camera, and of course the lens itself. So it's a good place to start if you're not sure about the Contax or you're just beginning to work with film for the first time. But nonetheless, if you jump into a Mamiya and you think you might want something more, the Contax is certainly worth looking into. So that's all for today. Again, my name is Hunter Harrison. You can find my work online at Hunter Photographic. And you can also keep up with my latest work on Instagram and Facebook. Thanks much.